Well, today we're going to class, and hopefully it's a master class to take your spinnerbait fishing to the next level. Well, spinnerbaits are one of those lures where most anglers tend to just take them out of the package and use them as is, and I've done that myself so many times. But with spinnerbaits especially, we are missing a huge opportunity. Now, as we're coming into the late summer and going into the fall, spinnerbaits really can take it up a notch. We know that they can work all year long, even in cold weather situations, but when those bass, both largemouth and smallmouth, start to key in on bait fish, wow, that is when a spinnerbait can really shine. But there are several things that we can do to these lures to make them more attractive to the body of water that you are fishing. So let's jump right into it. The first thing that I want to talk about with the spinnerbait fishing is the skirt, or the overall color pattern of the lure. Now, without a doubt, by far and away, probably the most popular spinnerbait skirt color is chartreuse and white, and that would be quickly followed up by white. We know that those are great fish catching lures, and they do an amazing job. Now, depending on the lake or river that you're fishing, we can make some real easy alterations to the color to help them mimic and match the forage base just a little bit more, and it might translate for you into many more bites throughout the course of the day. Now, we have many different skirt types here. I mean, we've got your sexy shad colors and we have your bluegill types of colors, but many of the forage situations are going to involve shad, gizzard shad, and minnows. I know on my lake here, minnows are really getting hammered right now, which leads us back to our whites and to our white and chartreuse. But if you've ever noticed bait fish, whether that's a minnow, threadfin shad, gizzard shad, alewife, depending on the light conditions, there's a little glimmer of blue in there, and we can add some blue to our spinnerbaits, and that can really match the forage and take it to that next level. So one thing that I love to do is just take a simple Sharpie, and I'm going to go ahead and grab a replacement skirt, whether that is white or that's white and chartreuse, and I will just take this Sharpie and just run it down the skirt strands. And you can see that it is absolutely amazing what a difference that makes quickly. And it's not recoloring the skirt to the point of changing it all to blue, but it adds just a little bit of color to it. That same type of small amount of color when you see a shad or a minnow in the sunlight and it turns and twists and it glimmers and you get that little reflection of blue. Now we've got a little reflection of blue here in the skirt. And I actually did one earlier and matched it up with a white and black head here, and I've actually got a twin-tail grub for a trailer on here. We'll get into that in a minute, but you can just see how nice that looks. And it, like I said, it's not overpowering as far as a blue color, but it's just enough to set your spinnerbait apart from maybe 10 others that are going down the shoreline. Here's one that I had done with some chartreuse and white and added a little bit of blue to it. Same thing. So that is my first tip for you, is go ahead and add the appropriate color to the skirt that's already there. It can just set it apart, make a huge, huge difference in your day of fishing. Now let's go ahead and talk about blades next. The first thing that I want to mention when it comes to a spinnerbait is the wire. This is such a critical component of the blades and how much thump and vibration they have. If you have a lighter wire, it is going to vibrate much more than a heavier wire. And depending on what type of spinnerbait you like to buy at the store, go ahead and, get several different models and investigate with that wire. How light of a wire is it? Now, obviously a lighter wire is more apt to bend and break than a heavier wire, but a heavier wire is just not going to get the vibration, and that could directly translate into fewer bites than a lighter wire. So that's the first thing to definitely keep in mind. Wire gauge, wire size makes a big difference. Now let's go ahead and jump into the blades. Most of us will go ahead and grab a spinnerbait and use the stock blades that they have on there. And by stock blades, I mean this size. I don't necessarily mean swapping out the blade with a different manufacturer, although you definitely couldn't do that. But I mean more the size of the blade. And we've got multiple sizes, obviously, and you've got multiple styles, your willow leafs, Indiana, Colorados, that type of stuff. And we know that willow leafs, very basic, more flash, less vibration. The more round or cupped the blade is, it's going to have greater thump, but not quite as much flash. But what I really want to get into with the blade is to adjust them based on the size of the forage. Not that many anglers actually do that. And later in the year, as your shad get larger, especially the gizzard shad, you can change out the blades. This one here is a number 5 willow leaf. And you can see if I've got a situation where I've got some minnows are my main forage base, or even some smaller shad, this is a really good all-around size. But if you've got gizzard shad, you're going to want to up that blade to something like a number 7. Die-hard spinnerbait anglers down in the Ozarks have been using number 7 willow leaf blades in the fall for decades, and let me tell you, they make a big difference as far as the quality of the bites that you are going to get. That blade matches the forage much better, and I've seen it over and over again down on Norfolk and Bull Shoals and Table Rock. A lot of these excellent spinnerbait anglers put a larger blade on their baits, especially in the fall. It can make a huge difference. So make sure you get yourself a box full of different blades. Blades are not that expensive. You can mix up the size and the color and throw some painted blades in there and swap them out based on the forage that you have present when you decide to pick up that spinnerbait. Another really quick tip when it comes to skirts on a spinnerbait, this one here it doesn't have your traditional rubber bands like these skirts do that eventually will dry rot and break. This is more of a rubber collar or a sleeve. But a real quick and easy tip is if you want to change up the color, the amount of color, let's say you buy a skirt and it has too much of one color strand in there, instead of slipping it on what is traditionally the right way, you can go ahead and flip it upside down and put that skirt on the other direction, and those outside strands are now in the inside. So once again, you'll see a lot of dedicated spinnerbait anglers mix up their colors by quickly popping that skirt off, flip it over, and then put it back on the other direction, and it gives a whole new dynamic to which strands are on the outside and which strands are now on the inside. So another real quick and easy tip for you. Now let's talk about solid colors or solid strands versus translucent. This one here is very much translucent. This one here has got your solid strands. The sunlight makes all the difference. If it is a bright sunny day, I'm going with the translucent strands. Bait fish in the sun look very different than they do on a cloudy day. If the sun is not out, then I'm going ahead and swap out my skirt and put more of the solid strands in there. It definitely makes a difference and matches the forage even better. So you need to have spinnerbaits for sunny days, spinnerbaits for cloudy days, and just carrying a bunch of different skirts with you means that you can just swap them out super quick without needing to retie all the time. Now let's talk about the depth and the speed of the spinnerbaits, and let's go ahead and start out with the depth. This is a question that I am asked all the time. As far as spinnerbait fishing goes, I like to bring the lure back where it is just out of sight. Now, depending on the water clarity of the place that you're fishing, it's going to make a huge difference. Maybe a foot is just out of sight, and maybe on a different body of water, 10 foot is just out of sight. But that is a great rule of thumb of a place to start with a spinnerbait, is bring that lure back where it is just out of sight. Your better predators like to hang down there in those shadows, a little bit murky area where that light penetration is not quite as good, and that is a great place to start with a spinnerbait. Now, oftentimes this means that we need to bring it back slowly, and in my experience, yes, there are days when burning a spinnerbait is dynamite. But day in and day out, I'm going to start with as slow as a retrieve as I possibly can. I want to go as slow as I can, but still let these blades maintain a good rotation. And this is especially true when you're working it up and over some timber. You know, you're pulling it across some rocks, you're bumping into the side of a dock. Is whenever you get in those really target areas, those key areas, I like to work it as slow as possible and let these blades really just turn slowly and do the work. If you look at bait fish, okay, you look at whether they're bluegills or shad, most of the time, unless they're actively getting chomped on by some predators, they're not really moving a whole lot. They're just kind of gliding along through the water. And like I said earlier, you can throw in some burning retrieves to see if you can trigger that reaction strike and kind of mimic that situation where a predator is chasing them. But rule of thumb number one, retrieve it just out of sight. Rule of thumb number two, as slow as you can possibly go, yet still maintain rotation of the blade. And that brings me to my next point, the contact. It's not unusual. As bass anglers, we know you want to make contact. I run crankbaits into stuff all the time. But unlike a square bill, for example, where I will pound it into a stump, often you'll leave it pause there just a second and then continue your retrieve. You don't want to do that with a spinnerbait. When you make contact with a spinnerbait, keep it coming. If you pause a spinnerbait, because the buoyancy is different, they'll often roll over and then go ahead and get hung up. So it's kind of takes some practice, because we're used to, with the crankbait, bang, pause it a second and then continue. With that spinnerbait, you'll want to keep it coming. You'll get by far fewer hang-ups that way. Now, what about when you're fishing open water, that point where you've come by the dock or you've come out of the stump field, you're past that lay down tree. When you have just open water, you can continue to mimic banging into things by just twitching that lure every once in a while. Keep the retrieve going steady and then just twitch it, and it gives it a real erratic dance, an unusual movement under the water, and you'll just trigger many, many more strikes that way. Now let's talk about trailers. You can definitely throw a spinnerbait with nothing on the back end of it. I've done that, most anglers have done that, but trailers can make a huge difference, and here's why. If you take a look at this particular setup right here, you notice how far back the blade is behind the hook. Oftentimes those bass will come up and they're attracted to that blade and they'll attack it right here and miss the hook. Well, I've seen anglers that will go ahead and take your R-bend and then they'll widen it out just a little bit, not so much to throw it out of tune, but they'll widen it out a little bit, and that'll bring the blade closer to the hook. That's one thing that you can do. Or you can go ahead and add a plastic trailer on here. This one I've put a twin tail grub on, and if you notice now, they're much more in line, and this trailer is more likely to attract the fish and come down and attack the bait where it should. So I like to throw trailers on here often. Twin tail grub is one of my favorites. I also really like to use just a single tail, or a, what you would say, a small 4-inch or 5-inch straight tail, I should say, finesse worm. This is an excellent choice as well. And as far as rigging it up on the hook, that's really personal preference. This one I have threaded all the way up, but you sure don't have to. You could just go ahead and just hook it right through the end and then get a little more length to it. So experiment with what you like to do and see how you like to hook those plastic trailers up. Now you can also use trailer hooks. That's another way to help eliminate missed strikes or strikes when they go after the blade. I'm kind of 50-50 on this. There's some days when I throw the trailer hook pretty religiously all the time. And then there's other days I prefer not to put the trailer hook on there, and I'll have the plastic trailer. If I'm really throwing it around some super heavy and gnarly stuff, I will forego the trailer hook and I will use just the plastic trailer. But if I've got more isolated and open water, I might put that trailer hook on there. So once again, that's really personal preference. I do have links to all these different types of products and blades and skirts and all that stuff down below in the description, so make sure that you go ahead and check that out, and be sure to go out and encourage someone today. You never know how you might just change their life. For the Bass Fishing Life, I'm your host, Steve Rogers.